Hey, what's up, guys? It's Robert Rule of 2 Review here, and today the Belmonts are back. It's my review of Castlevania Lords of Shadow 2. Alrighty, so first, no worries, the days of the really long reviews are completely over, like that Donkey Kong debacle from last week. That was crazy. I simply can't do reviews that long anymore, and I'm sure it's not fun for you guys. So moving on, Castlevania Lords of Shadow 2. Very interesting title, especially for myself as a huge Castlevania fan, mostly because I grew up in the NES days when the original Castlevania games, the first trilogy, was coming out on the NES, and they were so badass. I sort of consider Castlevania amongst those old school classics alongside Metroid, Zelda, Mario, things like that. I think Castlevania absolutely belongs in that conversation. It's been through a lot of different facelifts over the year, one could say. And for the most part, they've been good. I've always really enjoyed the games. I definitely would say that they have shined in 2D, absolutely. From the NES games to Super Castlevania 4. My favorite Castlevania game of all time is Dawn of Sorrow for the Game Boy Advance. That is an unbeatable masterpiece. A lot of people laud Symphony of the Night as the best Castlevania or one of the best Castlevania games, and that is a completely fair and okay statement. That game does kick ass, and yes, it really did usher in, I'm going to use it, this term has to be used in a review like this, it certainly did usher in the Metroidvania kind of gameplay for Castlevania. And I think that that's great. I think, that's been a fantastic thing for the series. They've, of course, dabbled in 3D back in the 64 days with Castlevania 64, and there was another one, too, that Castlevania something else 64. Those two games, which I never played, sadly, but I only heard dreadful things about, and I've seen some footage, not good stuff. On the PS2 Xbox era, they started coming out with some 3D ones, Lament of Innocence and another one, and they took that in one step further last generation / still kind of this generation with the Lords of Shadow games, which, of course, included Lords of Shadow on the PS3 and the Xbox 360, and then Lords of Shadow Mirror of Fate on the 3DS last year. Both of those games kicked ass. Like, really surprisingly, I was a huge fan of them both. And then, of course, just this week, we finally get Lords of Shadow 2, right here near the end of the generation. This last generation, as we're getting ready for what may come with Castlevania moving forward with the PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and Wii U. So it's a pretty big deal. Again, the Lords of Shadow caught a lot of people off guard. It mostly was received well, and it was a very high production game. I think that was the thing that surprised me the most, is how much time and effort was put into it. They crafted a really excellent lore, a really cool story expanding on the Belmont mythos. And it was just visually amazing. The combat system was really, really deep and well executed. It was a solid action game, very much in the vein of the Devil May Cry, the Bayonetta, the God of War, stuff like that. So it's kind of expanding on that action genre, which I'm not going to lie, I'm kind of a sucker for. I love that stuff when it's done well. So I appreciated what they did with it. Is it the best way to play Castlevania? Absolutely not. I really hope that they move forward with the stuff going forward. Mirror of Fate on the 3DS, by the way, in case you're not familiar, that's kind of a step in the right direction, because that game, although it was 3D and it was very good looking and it used a very similar God of War-esque control scheme like the first Lords of Shadow, it still was playing on a mostly 2D kind of plane, and I really appreciated that. And in a lot of ways, not all of them, but a lot of them, it worked really well. So that was pretty cool. Regardless, to the point, Lords of Shadow 2, it's a direct sequel to Lords of Shadow, the console game, which was a 3D crazy action game. And so here we go with the sequel. A lot of production, a lot of buzz behind it. So I'm basically going to talk about my thoughts. So first and foremost, is Lords of Shadow 2 better than Lords of Shadow? I gotta say, no, it's not. And at first I thought it was going to be, and I really wanted it to be, and I would even be lying if I didn't say that in some ways it is absolutely better than Lords of Shadow, because that is true. However, the overall package doesn't seem to quite live up to the legacy of its predecessor, only because I was a huge fan of that first one. I even replayed through it, as a lot of you might have saw. Following the channel, in the weeks or so leading up to it, I was posting a lot of gameplay of the first Lords of Shadow. And Lords of Shadow 2, here's where it's better than the first game. And this is one of the most important factors. It's the combat. I have to tell you, for this kind of game, that God of War, Devil May Cry, crazy, fast-paced, super acrobatic, combo-heavy type of combat and gameplay, Lords of Shadow 2 is among the very, very, very best. I mean, You got to think God of War 3, Bayonetta, Lords of Shadow 2, it's right there. I think strictly from a gameplay perspective, it is better than any of the Devil May Cry games, including the new one, which was pretty freaking good, I'm not going to lie. Even though I think Bayonetta is still the better game, it could even play better than Bayonetta. I'm not really 100% sure, but it's in that realm. It is in that discussion. That is how good this game is. What they've done with the chain, I can't remember the name of his the cross blade thing that he uses, that's his chain. It just feels amazing. It's buttery smooth. There's a lot of depth to it, kind of too much, which I'm going to get into in a minute. But I mean, at the end of the day, it's fantastic. Lords of Shadow was a very solid feeling game as far as that action combat felt, but it had some clunkiness to it, and it didn't necessarily feel super smooth. What you're able to do in this game is phenomenal. The dodge mechanic is improved. The combo system is improved. The amount of moves available to you throughout the game is improved. Again, not necessarily to the benefit of the game overall, but still pretty freaking cool. I will say that some of the enemies kind of become difficult to play due to the combo system. So screw it. I'll just go ahead and get into that now. It's the problem with the combo system, and this is something that does hinder the game, is that it's almost too deep for its own good. I'm not going to lie. This kind of game doesn't need near the amount of strategy that the moveset would actually require you to need to use every single move available to you. I hate to go on a negative tangent here, but I simply have to say it is admirable. And I super appreciate that they put so much into this game. You've got 3 main weapons. You've got your cross chain thing that I'm just an asshole for not remembering what it is. You've got a sword, a blade that helps refill your life as you use it, and you have these gauntlets. I don't remember any of these names. What a jerk. Anyway, and you've got these gauntlets which give you this punching ability, and they're building on similar ideas from the previous game too. And so you've got those 3 main weapons plus your regular attacks, and all of those have crazy trees of abilities that you can build on as you're earning, points for basically defeating enemies throughout the game. Very similar to a lot of games, including the first Lords of Shadow. And that whole system works. It works really well, and it works overall awesomely in Lords of Shadow 2. The problem is there's just so much going on. They've used every single button to the point where it's overusage. DMC, not Devil May Cry, but the most recent DMC is a good example where that game used this awesome mechanic of left trigger used your light and angelic attacks, and the right trigger used your demonic attacks, and you could, on the fly go in and out of them and use these attacks for different enemies. And it was great. And what they tried to do with Lords of Shadow 2 is the same concept, which is a good sound concept, and they tried to expand upon it. But it's in a way where it's just a little bit cumbersome. It doesn't feel near as smooth. And because they've given you so much to do, you're never going to need it all. I mean, when you start buying, I was buying so many moves, and I was like, dude, I can't even remember which moves I bought and how to do them. And even though there's kind of the same controls, regardless of which weapon you're using, it just sort of felt like too much. And I'm not a noob to these kind of games. I mean, I have the ability to play these kinds of games, but I'm telling you, it just was more than was necessary. And it's double a shame because on the positive side, most of the moves you could buy are badass, especially when you start spreading them across the different weapons available. I mean, there's cool shit to do in this game. That's the reason that the combat is so good, is because the breadth of what they allow you to do and the way that these moves are put together is phenomenal. So fun to watch. When you can pull off the really complicated ones, you feel like a vampire killing badass. And that's what they wanted. They did achieve that. The problem is it's just too much, and it kind of was drawing the focus away because I would sort of become a little too over reliant on trying to remember and wanting to do these moves I spent 5,000 points on, and then I'm realizing it's not even practical to use this thing in combat. These kinds of games, this kind of game, Lords of Shadow 2, while it's nice to try to make it as deep as possible, it doesn't need it, especially when you've made it feel control-wise so perfect, because it is that perfect. Why did you try to make it so deep? You didn't need to do that. Something else that this game does, which is very much like the first Lords of Shadow, is it uses this book mechanic where when you're going into your menus and you're looking at your map and you're reading lore and using your XP to level up your abilities, you're flipping through this book that looks like an old parchment written with like a quill ink kind of feather pen, and it's like that stuff. It's just a little too crazy. It honestly gave me a headache trying to flip through it. It just seemed like it was another thing where stylistically it's super cool and I appreciate what they were going for, but it didn't end up feeling practical to the game and the menu navigating experience overall. It was just a little bit too much. It was kind of disjointed, and something else that felt kind of cumbersome, So it's weird that some of these things that are not really good things to talk about are still good in and of themselves. They just are not necessary and they don't benefit this game. You know, it's great to have a bunch of moves at your disposal, but it's too much for Lords of Shadow 2. Kind of holds the combat back. It's really cool and authentic and neat to flip through this old school looking book and read all this lore and look at all this shit, but it becomes too confusing and it's just more than what needs to be. So great ideas that were executed just not perfectly that held back a really, really good game from being potentially a really, really great one. Something else that was an interesting twist to the game that was both good and bad is the way that the world is set up. The first Lords of Shadow was set up in a kind of chapter or level scenario where you're going from chapter to chapter. You have a beginning and an end to each chapter, fairly linear despite the large size of the worlds and all the different chapters you would go through. And this game operates on what they attempted to make kind of a hub world because you're really just in Gabriel Belmont's castle, exploring the castle, going from area to area and trying to figure out what's going on. And I didn't really think that worked overall. It's a great concept. However, the castle was really poorly laid out. I hate to say that, but it just didn't feel cohesive. And the map was awful. It was great that they tried to give you a map, but I'm going to tell you guys right now, it just didn't really lend to the experience. It made it actually very, very hard to tell what was going on and where you needed to go, even though they tried to give you markers and stuff. And they used this wolf calling mechanic that lets you warp between different areas of the map and of the castle and stuff. But it just doesn't make sense. Like, you have no need. This game, the castle isn't laid out in a Metroid kind of way where the backtracking ever feels good, makes sense, or you know where you're going. They tried to do it. And another thing that I commend them in doing, however, it just didn't feel right. And it was, you never need to backtrack in this game. You simply don't. I mean, you just kind of got to find your way. Like, you get to this new place and it's like, okay, like, where do I need to go? Like, I can probably go to all these different directions, but I can't even tell where I've been and where I haven't been. And I just want to find the area that takes me to the next new thing to do. And that's what I was doing. Every time I got to something new, I loved it. And I became invested again. And the story, which I'm going to get to in a minute, was interesting enough. And I appreciated the setting. But trying to get from like important point to important point was just really kind of cumbersome, you know? I mean, the areas of the castle that you're in are all really neat. It's just the fact that they're trying to make you weave in and out of the same areas, and it becomes a confusing mess. I hate to admit it, but it really did become a confusing mess. That being said, like I said, the actual traversal of the environments was fantastic. I mean, the climbing mechanic in this game is done really, really well. There's a lot of cool places that you can kind of discover and move around. You're very, very nimble as Gabriel Belmont in this game, aka Dracula. So, you know, it's all executed very, very well. It's just the way that the castle was put together was just way too confusing for its own good. And all the environments look the same. Something that I thought was fantastic about the first Lords of Shadow is that you're all over the place. You're inside, you're outside, you're in caves, you're in the forest, you're on an ice area. It's daytime, it's nighttime. You have completely varied environments. In this game, not so much, which also leads me to, beyond being in the castle, the actual setting for the game, so I can finally wrap up this review. And this is something that some people were actually down on, and I, however, am not down on it. Even though they didn't execute it the way I wanted, I think it's pretty cool. You're actually playing as Gabriel Belmont in this game in a modern setting, including Zobak, the character who was voiced by Patrick Stewart, who was kind of your guide and helped you out through a lot of the first Lords of Shadow. He's, of course, still alive and still around, and you get resurrected present day. So you're in a city, like a warehouse district city, which is really stinking cool. You know, you start off the game as you wake up, and you're still kind of trying to get your bearings and heal yourself because you've been, in a coffin for the last several thousand years, and you're not quite fully healed, and you're walking around a city street with cars going by and people on the sides of the street begging you for money because they don't know who you are. And the whole setting is that way, and you have to consistently go back to Zobak's kind of office building, and you're literally in a modern day office building as Gabriel Belmont running around as you get little different orders from him because Zobak is having you do things, and his motives are very shifty, and of course I can't really talk about that. It's a fairly interesting concept that overall I thought worked really well. Yes, you're hindered by the fact that the game is very dark. You're in the castle the whole time. It's very dark. The few times you go outside, which is very cool, it's still dark outside. It's fucking cloudy all the time. It's never, I just got so used to and appreciated the varied environments of the first game that I felt a little bit more claustrophobic with this one being always dark, mostly inside, never daylight, yada, yada. But that being said, the fact that you're in this modern day setting, I thought was really cool, and it did work to the game's credit. Some people don't seem to like it. I don't know why. I was a huge fan of it. It kind of felt like Underworld a little bit, if that makes sense. I mean, that's the very beginning of the game, too. It definitely had that kind of vibe, and I think those movies are great for one thing, just for the pure fun of them. And I think it worked really, really well for a Castlevania game. So in summary, although I kind of touched on some of the more negative things, don't get me wrong, at the end of the day, I actually still really have enjoyed and am still enjoying Lords of Shadow 2. It's a solid game. The fantastic, wonderful, unbeatable gameplay is enough to sell this game to me and to probably a lot of action fans. The story is more convoluted than it needs to be. It's a little bit melodramatic. I don't love the castle hub mechanic, and I think it's a little bit confusing to navigate the menus and stuff. But honestly, because the gameplay is so good, I like that stuff because you do so much fighting, and the fighting feels so phenomenal when you find the moves that you want to stick with and use over and over again. It feels great, and that really sells it. Also, the boss battles, let me tell you guys, as someone who's losing interest in boss battles as a whole in the gaming genre, man, these are some of the best. I never, ever disliked a boss battle. I never was like, oh God, I have to fight another boss I don't want to do. But every time I had someone to fight, I loved it. They were very well put together, a lot of fun, really clever, unique ideas happening, and the combat felt so good throughout all the boss battles that it ultimately justified everything going on. So yes, there are a few things that kind of hold the game back, but the fantastic combat, gorgeous visuals, which I sadly didn't talk about either, by the way, and the awesome boss battles totally sell this game to me. So is it perfect? No. Is it as good as the previous Lords of Shadow? No. Is it awesome? Absolutely. So my personal score is a very solid and $60 worthy 8.1. Please check this game out. If you liked the first one, you're probably going to like it. If you like action games, you're probably going to like it. If you're not too big into either of those or on the fence about the game overall, you may want to check it out first. I can't say it's a definite buy, but for Castlevania or action game fans, definitely a game you're going to love. Alrighty guys, that's all for my Lords of Shadow 2 review. Hopefully you dug it and appreciated my opinion and it made you kind of think about what you wanted to do with the game. Of course, you can now check out this review and other great gaming content on freeforgeeks.com and the Free For All podcast, the links that I'm going to have for you guys below. Of course, if you like what I'm doing, you can always feel free to subscribe, like, and share the video and share your comments and your thoughts below. Thank you so much as always for tuning in, guys, and I will catch you next time.